Welcome to this episode of Underground Strategy. My name is Anne Flassbler and I am an assistant professor in international relations at Durham University. The episode you are about to listen to is student-led and was created in the context of the module Contemporary Challenges of United Nations Peacekeeping, which I co-teach with Tony, one of the Postcard's hosts, and Tara Lyle. The module is part of the Durham Global Security Institute's 2 MSc programs, which are called Defense Development and Diplomacy and Conflict Prevention and Peacebuilding. I hope you will enjoy listening to this episode.
Just a quick introduction of me. My name is Max Lauker. I'm in my 40s and I'm probably very underqualified to teach anything about peace and conflict resolution. But I have spent a lot of time on the ground, so I hope that makes up for it. I served just under 18 years across different components of the armed forces and the government, and I started out as an Arctic Ranger. Then I moved into the Special Forces community and later into intelligence. And I have served overseas in both peacekeeping and peace enforcement capabilities, notably in Kosovo, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and parts of Africa. And I'm from Sweden, by the way, if that wasn't already obvious.
Thanks for that. So my career started in the South African Army in around about 2001. So that is after the new South Africa gets formed, so sort of the democratic process is really underway. We have integration. And I joined the South African Army and then I joined the Engineer Corps. I became a combat engineer. And then I went to the military academy and I did some of my studies. I went back to my regiment and then I did peacekeeping. There was a lot of our focus at the time. So in terms of where South Africa was, we had what was called the African Renaissance. So there was a lot of effort, this whole thing with Thabo Mbeki was deploy forces and try to secure Africa, make it safe, make it a wonderful place to be. And we deployed to different areas like Burundi, like Congo, like Sudan. And that was mostly our focus, and that tied in peacekeeping. And we didn't look at it only as peacekeeping, but there was also more offensive pieces in it, like robust peacekeeping and offensive operations. And then there were also some other ones in the Central African Republic. I was involved in it from the point of view of our regiment, which was we supported infantry operations, we supported different types of deployments in peacekeeping. And yeah, it was loads of fun. As I mentioned, so I was in Darfur and I was later on in my career in Congo and then the non-UN missions too, on the borders and internal security missions and so on. And then I left in 2016 and did some more academic stuff and some more management stuff. And that's really my career in a nutshell.
Perfect. Thank you. Given your experiences, to what extent do you think there is a role for special forces within peacekeeping?
Yeah, that is actually a really good question. I mean, if you're asking for my personal view, then yes, I think there is a role for special forces in peacekeeping, but it's complicated and probably not the role most people would think. The way I see it, special forces are often overused in peacekeeping context, or maybe misused is the better word for it. You have to ask yourself, what are they actually doing there? Because in most cases, they're not doing peacekeeping in the traditional sense. They're doing peace enforcement, in my opinion, most of the time. They're supporting the mission, sure, but often from the shadows and often with objectives that don't really belong within the peacekeeping mandate. And that's where it gets muddy. Whose agenda are they working on? Is it the UN's, the host nations, allied forces, their own national interest? And most of the time, it's a bit of everything. So that mix creates a gray zone where things aren't clearly aligned with the mission goals. And that is really dangerous. But at the same time, I get it. I mean, peacekeeping environments are basically seen as good proving grounds, for nations to test capabilities, to run intelligence operations, to deploy their special forces in low visibility setting. And in that sense, yes, there is always a role for special forces, especially in the early stages when the conflict is still active or just about to cool off a bit. Take Kosovo or the Balkans more broadly. You had a short, intense phase of war followed by what looked like some kind of stability, right? But special forces stayed embedded for years, 15 years in some cases, not because conventional forces couldn't handle the situation, but because there were other interests, other objectives. And if you're not serving the host government, not helping the police, not stabilizing civil society, then who are you really working for? And it's the same thing in Afghanistan, but with a twist. Of course, Afghanistan wasn't a UN peacekeeping mission. It was a NATO-led peace enforcement operation. But even there, you saw the same dynamic. And in almost every conflict where I have worked personally under a so-called peacekeeping umbrella, it's mostly been about embedding yourself in that peacekeeping environment. And I never had an objective that was actually connected to the peacekeeping mandate itself. The peacekeeping force has just been the vessel, something to hide behind, just like how we sometimes embed ourselves with NGOs and similar organizations. It's not to support their work, but to mask our own presence. You're inside a mission, but your goal is something entirely different. So yeah, the role is real, but controversial, especially once the active combat phase ends. During the war, special forces are doing what they always do. They are shaping the battlefield, gathering intel, prepping for conventional forces, all of that. But after that, they morph into something else. More intelligence-focused, more embedded, more ambiguous. And at some point, you have to ask, are they contributing to peace or just operating in the shadows? So yeah, I think there is a role, but it's a dangerous one if it's left unchecked.
If you don't mind me just disagreeing with Max on that, I can't speak for special forces because I am not in special forces or have not served in the special forces. But how I've seen the deployments was as Max says, and in the South African case, they were used to help fight M23 in 2013-14, and they were deployed. They get sort of under the cover of the infantry. A couple of sections of special forces soldiers were put in, and some friends of mine, who I trained with and studied with earlier in back when they were conventional soldiers and officers. That's where we met them, and we met again in the DRC, and they were used to bolster that initial fight with M23. So as Max says, they have a pivotal role at certain points. They can be a force multiplier. They aren't so they're doing some of that reconnaissance, some of that specialized direct assault stuff, etc. And then afterwards, I think by 2015, I remember not seeing them anymore. So what the official line is, I'm not sure, but that's what I remember seeing in the field. And then also for South Africa, I think in the fight in Bangui in Central African Republic in 2013. Lots of issues around that time. It was a bilateral agreement. So it wasn't technically a UN mission, or I think there was a UN mission, training mission attached to it. And thank God we had those special forces there, because if we didn't, though the Seleka rebels had attacked, if we didn't, there was also elite infantry and good conventional soldiers too, but training of the special forces, it helped. There were quite a few deaths, unfortunately, but if they weren't there, the casualty rate would have been much higher for us.
Yeah, I get that. And I agree fully that there will always be cases where special forces are absolutely critical in the field. I've seen that too. I worked in that role, and sometimes tactically it works. But the problem is what happens next. What's the long-term objective? Who are they really supporting? And that is where things start getting murky. Because if you're not building anything behind it, if there is no structure, no legitimacy, then even a successful operation just buys time. And that time gets wasted. So yeah, I don't think it's black and white, but I still think we have to ask ourselves those harder questions. Because when special forces becomes the go-to answer, it's usually a sign that no one has a plan for what comes after that. And again, are you actually contributing to peace or just executing another country's agenda under a blue flag? And that's why I say it's complicated. It's a difficult question because the roles may be justified tactically, like I said, but strategically and ethically, it's a lot messier.
Do you believe the UN has the right relationship with intelligence? And if not, how do you think this should change?
No, I don't think the UN has the right relationship with intelligence today. And by the way, this is actually a great question to bring up with Peter de Clercq later as well. because from a UN diplomatic perspective, he might have a very, very different take on this. But from my side, based on what I've seen on the ground, I would say no. Part of the problem, in my opinion, is that UN has lost a lot of its capacity, both in terms of soft power and hard power. It's not the organization it used to be. And because of that, nations don't trust it enough to share meaningful intelligence. You get little bits, small fragments here and there, things that are mostly harmless or maybe already outdated. But the full-on intelligence sharing, almost never. And honestly, I think that's the right call. Even back in my day, it was clear that the UN didn't have the systems in place to handle sensitive material. And we're not just talking about protecting it, but to act on it. Who within the UN actually receives that intelligence? Who verifies it? Who turns it into actionable intelligence? And the answers are often unclear. And when you're dealing with intelligence, uncertainty like that, it's going to be a definite deal breaker. And then there is the moral problem. The UN is supposed to work for the people, for peace, for human rights, protection, all of that. But intelligence, on the other hand, that works for a state, and sometimes it just works for itself. And if we imagine a full intelligence sharing with the UN, that would mean asking the organization to accept the kind of collateral damage that is built into the intelligence work, to look the other way, to delay action to protect the source, for example. And that is not what the UN is built to do. And a classic example of that would be the Enigma, for example. We cracked the German code during the Second World War, but we let convoys get attacked, we let a lot of people die, and that was because protecting the secret was more important than the effect. And also, of course, it's for the greater good, but that means sacrifice at some part, right? That was a calculated sacrifice, but that's a position you can't put an organization like the UN in. It's not built to carry that kind of weight, and it shouldn't be. Because then it's no longer working for the people. It's just playing the same game as the rest of us. And that was never the intention. To put it in perspective, we can compare it to how it works in NATO, for example. You got shared frameworks, common objectives, we have trust between member states. And even if it's never perfect, it kind of works. And that's the kind of intelligence culture people often wish that the UN had. But without the infrastructure, it's just not possible. So no, I don't think the UN setup supports meaningful intelligence sharing. And as I said, it's not just a technical problem. It's political, structural, all of that. And personally, I think we're at the point where we either need to rebuild the UN's capacity from the ground up, or we need to start thinking about creating some kind of alternative institutions that can handle this space. And maybe the war in Ukraine will actually force that. I mean, we already seen it, but the war in Ukraine will force that conversation a bit. And maybe we will see something new emerge in Europe, or maybe a revival of the UN in a more focused form or something like that. But as it stands today, no, I don't think the UN is the right place for serious intelligence work in any category. Time for a tactical reload. If you're enjoying this, leave a review on your platform. YouTube crew, hit subscribe to support the mission. Let's roll.
So we are moving on to the second part of our podcast. That's the internal dynamics within the UN peacekeeping missions. So within multinational contexts like peacekeeping, how have you managed to navigate differences in terms of the military culture, language, and equipment that the different true contributing countries bring in?
Do you want to lead the charge on this one, Tony?
Yeah, it's tricky. Just to build on what Max had said initially, the UN is an organization. It's a supranational one, and it's all its member states, right? So it has the interests of the whole world there. So when you share intelligence, you really are sharing it with the whole world, and that's tricky. But often we think about the secretariat, the actual officials there, and that also becomes tricky in itself. And the same goes for the culture clash with the forces provided. I think we touched on this a little bit earlier today or yesterday. Just in the past, maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was a lot of European countries, developed world or the global north, sending troops into peacekeeping. Often countries are aligned in terms of NATO operations and so on. But when you take from such a wide range of countries, South Africa, Pakistan, India, Malawi, Tanzania, Kenya, Brazil, Uruguay, and then throw in staff officers sprinkled from everywhere. I mean, I've worked as staff officers from, you name it really. Bolivia, Peru, Russia, Ukraine, all in the same brigade headquarters, right? So I think the day-to-day operations, you can kind of get by just because you have an objective, you need to move something from A to B, but combining that into a cohesive peacekeeping force that does the right things at the right time, is strong when it needs to be, that's more challenging. You need the right force commander, you need the right SRSG, and then you also need, I would say, direction from the Security Council. And we discussed about resources earlier, that it's so constrained. So I would say it's very difficult. And then, I was mentioning to some folks yesterday when we were chatting, there was the Swiss captain deployed, and he was a staff officer. And there was a Uruguayan captain that had to be sent, he had to go somewhere for whatever reason. And he said, hey, do you mind if I take command of this platoon? And, the people very respectfully told him, it's not that you aren't capable or good. It's just that one is a lion and the other one's a tiger. You are both strong. You are just very different. And that's kind of very much, the UN. It's such a mix. It's polyglot. It's a hodgepodge of so many things. So how it's overcome is through, I would say, the basic administration of the mission. So there's logistics. Something comes in, something goes out. I think there's a common goal in the sense that, there's enough deployments or movements and patrols that can be done in a normal way. But there's different rhythms that operate at the same time. And in that is some of the complexity. So you can't respond as what you would want to. You move like the dinosaur, like a T-Rex. You go slowly towards the objective with your two small hands in the front. And when you turn around, it takes forever, but your tail wipes out like, 10 years of time, because it just takes so long to move this. It's like turning the Titanic. And that's some of the complexity. Sorry for throwing all those analogies into the same sentence. Max?
Yeah, those are good analogies, Tony. And I think one of the core problems, like you said, is the framework itself. Because the UN structure is different. It's not something that's used day in and day out. Of course, there are standards, but they're not being exercised or maintained the way they are in NATO, for example. The NATO framework is alive. It's running all the time, even during peacetime. Everyone knows their roles. The headquarters staff is already functioning before deployment. So command and control becomes second nature. In the UN mission, on the other hand, everyone is technically under the same umbrella, but in practice, it's just a bunch of isolated islands. You're coordinating bubbles, kind of not a system. And that's a huge difference, in my opinion. But I think it wasn't always like this. I actually think UN was better back in the 80s and the 90s, and probably even more before that, where it had more weight internationally and more continuity in its missions in one way. Probably at that point, it was already, at the end of the row. But today, it really depends on which countries are involved, because that is what matters, unfortunately. It can become, honestly, a complete shit show. Different military cultures, different languages, different gear. You got countries showing up with no gear, no training, no clue how to integrate. You just there to tick a box or earn a paycheck. Meanwhile, you're trying to run an operation. And that's not peacekeeping. That's just chaos dressed in blue helmets, if I'm going to be a bit blunt. Now on the ground, for the average soldier, it's usually manageable. You are still going to be under national command, and you can work things out locally. But the moment you move up into the staff level, headquarters, planning, coordination, all of that, that's where things really change. The staff level, it is not about getting things done. It's about avoiding offense, protecting turf, and playing nice with 15 different other agendas at the same time. And in my opinion, that's one of the reasons that operations often stall and, you don't get any conclusive results. But we can take Sweden as an example. We come from a flat system. I could be a sergeant and have a conversation with the colonel, and there would be no drama about that. If I'm a specialist in something, my voice carries weight. And that just doesn't translate in a lot of these multinational missions. You end up giving people fake ranks just so they can sit in the same room, because otherwise they won't be allowed to speak, blah, blah, blah. And that kind of strict hierarchy kills flexibility. You lose your edge because your best people can't get through the layers. And in those systems, especially the more rigid ones, it takes forever for anything to trickle down and have effect on the ground. So from my perspective, yeah, it's very different, especially from someone coming from a much, much flatter military culture like Sweden. Then again, it also depends who you ask. For a regular soldier out on patrol, it might not feel so different at all. But on the staff level, I think it's a different world.
So the next question would be, how do you compare your experiences from being under the command of your national forces compared to multinational forces?
Yeah, I touched on this earlier, but it's a very good question. And the truth is, most missions today are run under some kind of multinational command in some way at some level. That's just how the world works now. And it's not all that bad. I mean, there are real positives. You get access to a broader pool of capabilities, usually specialist capabilities. And I mean, you can bolster your air power, your mechanized capabilities and all of that, intelligence sharing. There's a good development curve, both for individual soldiers and for whole units. It opens up a lot of doors. You build networks, you learn how the militaries function and all of that. Politically, also, it's easier to sell. If you got a dozen flags on the ground, it's harder for the public back home to push back. It gives legitimacy to the mission, even if the mechanics behind it are far from perfect, of course. But yeah, if you compare to national command, it's a completely different environment. Under your own system, things are familiar, the tempo, the logic, decision-making, everything else works much, much faster. And you can solve most problems directly. You don't spend half of your time navigating sensitivities and trying to guess how an order is going to land in 5 different chains of command. And in a multinational setting, even if the intent is shared, the execution isn't. Take Afghanistan, for example. You had friction right from the ground up. I remember cases when the Brits were unsure if the Americans were forcing their hand on targets that might not be legit or didn't line up with their own political stance. There was pressure for them to be more aggressive in Helmand and Kandahar, for example. And that tension doesn't just live in the staff room. It bleeds down to the soldiers as well. And it adds friction that shouldn't be there. Then you have the opposite experience, like in the later stages of the KFOR mission in Kosovo. You've got 1 billion nations involved, and it's basically low-intensity policing operation. No one is pushing an agenda. No one is looking to escalate. Everyone goes to bed with clean sheets and gets back to it in the morning. So in that case, the structure really doesn't matter as much. It runs on autopilot and it works absolutely fine. So yeah, there are both pros and cons. Multinational command comes with political weight and a very big toolbox, but you trade away speed, unity, and the ability to react more cleanly, if we can put it like that. Because national command is sharper, more efficient, and easier to trust in most instances. But it's not how things are done anymore, and very much so on the peacekeeping level. And like we talked about earlier, a lot of things also comes down to culture, right? How do you see hierarchy? Who gets listened to? And how rigid or flexible your system actually is. I don't know. What do you think, Tony? You are in the old British system yourself, or you've been a part of it for quite some time.
Yeah, there's definitely a cultural element there. So that kind of, some people have that more large distance between the higher up, so that power distance, if we're going to go into some boring academic term, so there's a big power distance in some cultures. One has to pay all the, the usual respects and all that. But I found for the day-to-day, once we have that layer of formality taken out the way, it was perfectly fine, working with the Indian military or the Pakistani military, or working with, soldiers from China, I found it very easy. But that was only because a level of professionalism, like if you can understand each other and what you want to achieve together, then quickly, as Max mentioned, you got to accept that each culture is to be a certain amount of saluting and yes and no, sir, or whatever, or no, ma'am, yes, ma'am, whatever whichever way. But then when we take all of that apart, there's actually a mission to achieve. And that's where I think for most people, that's where you want to get to really quickly.
Just building off that, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the challenges and the opportunities you've both seen within the process of building military cultures, both within multinational coalitions, but also within your own national contingents, I think particularly of the South African Defence Forces after 1994, which obviously would have been fairly recent when you first joined?
Yeah, so it's a good question. For myself, I joined in 2001. And then, as I went through the system, we had the legacy of the apartheid army had been in power for a very long time. And then from 94, to be fair, there was discussions long before that, but officially 94, 95, 96, maybe 97 also, there was the integration of forces. So a number of armies were combined. There was the MK, UPLA, those were the so-called guerrilla armies, those fighting for liberation. There was the South African Defence Force, which is the apartheid forces, more conventionally strong. And then we had what was called the homelands, so Transkei, Ciskei, etc. They had their own forces, but they were largely funded by the South African Defence Force. And also part of the apartheid system more broadly. That's a whole other debate. So these forces had to come together. But by the time I had joined, we had one major encounter in Lesotho. That was 1998. I was not there. I was in high school. And then after that, from 2001 onwards, there was really sort of so-called African Renaissance, Thabo Mbeki and, NEPAD and all that. So that's when we started with our missions in Africa, 2002, 3, etc. My experience was very much that we got to that practical level I was just mentioning now really quickly. Even if someone was MK or UPLA or whatever, I think in my career, I can remember one incident where there was a political comment made between two. I'm not saying it didn't exist, right? I mean, overall, day to day, people got on with things. It was in the background because people of a certain former force or army got certain promotions or, they were favored because they were seen as part of the liberation. So MK would have more promotions than UPLA, than SADF, and there would also be a racial element attached to it. 7 black people, 2 Indian people, 1 white person, etc. So there would be a racial element attached to it in South Africa also. Fair discrimination in that sense. But overall, there was no big fights. There may have been initially between some MK and UPLA members, 95, 96. But by the time I joined, I never saw it. It was very rare. In fact, most of our discussions were always about the look forward. Where are we currently? What do we have to do? What's the next mission? And whether it was a SADF commander, whether it was an MK commander, whether it was a sergeant from this, whether it was a corporal from that was in the background. It was in the background because it affected promotion. But in general terms, people just got on the way that people get on based on, personality. Do we play the same sport? Do we, what team do you support? This kind of thing. So that was my experience. And then when we integrated with other forces, it was just tying more back to what we had discussed previously. But I'll mention that there was a similar process in Zimbabwe. And the Rupert Smith we spoke about earlier, the general, he was involved there too, because there were 2 Zimbabwean armies and then also the former Rhodesian forces. And the British were involved in helping to coalesce them. That's a topic of a whole other debate because we've had some stellar scouts and we've had a few different points of view. So we're keen to get the Zimbabwean side on that, but that's for another day.
Going up to the next question. With all the Scandinavian nations now part of the NATO, how will it impact NATO's security position relative to Russia in the Arctic theater?
Oh yeah, that is a really interesting question. With Finland and Sweden now in NATO, alongside Norway and the US presence in Alaska, you got more NATO flags in the Arctic than we have ever had before. But whether that actually shifts the balance against Russia, that depends on what kind of control we're talking about here. Because in reality, Russia has held the upper hand in the Arctic for decades. They got nuclear-powered icebreakers, they managed the Northern Sea route, and they have done it not because they are more advanced than us, but because no one else in the West wanted to make those investments. It's expensive, it's cold, and for a long time it didn't seem to be worth it. But now, with the ice melting and the accessibility increasing, the Arctic is becoming more strategic, especially in terms of trade routes and resources. And the Northern Sea route could be a game changer if it becomes accessible year-round without icebreakers. And that's where Russia and China are already way ahead. Now, if you're asking what Finland and Sweden actually adds to NATO's Arctic posture, I'd say not that much in a direct Arctic-specific sense. It's not like they're bringing deep-sea Arctic capabilities or something like that. What they do bring is strategic depth, geography, more airspace, more flank security, more conventional reinforcement. But that is still on the European side of the map. The Arctic game is different. And it comes down to what you actually want to achieve up there. If it is about surveillance, monitoring, asserting presence, I mean, we're already doing that. But if it's about dominating the trade routes, extracting resources, then we're talking about massive infrastructure, heavy logistics, and sustained investments. And honestly, I don't think the West is willing to pay for that right now. It's easier to just monitor the Arctic than physically control it. And of course, we also have to take a look at Greenland, because there's been a lot of hot air, as we all know, around it lately. But let's be honest, aside from the resource aspects, which is obviously what interests the Americans, they already have what they need. I mean, the US have their major base, the Thule Air Base, which is a significant strategic asset. And I don't think they need to build much more than that. The capabilities are already there, what they need for what they are doing. And unlike other multinational operations where you can just patch together a force and make it work, up in the Arctic, the environment sets the terms. You don't just show up with their flag and hope for the best. If you don't have the capacity, the Arctic will remind you very, very quickly who's boss. We might see that frontier heat up if Russia collapses or if competition over resources intensifies. But for now, I think the NATO focus will stay on rebuilding conventional forces in Europe, Ukraine, of course, and we'll probably try to expand surveillance and early warning capabilities in the Arctic, but not hard control, not yet. I think it's just too resource intensive. So is the Arctic important? Absolutely. But it's not where the real shift will happen in the short term. It's a long game. And right now we're still playing catch up.
We've got another question related to Russia. So in the face of the war in Ukraine and Europe's current shifts in foreign policy, how do you feel about Europeans' unity if the conflict happened to escalate and spill over? And do you think that the current European defense framework will be robust enough with, for instance, a non-united military and also the rise of populism being keen with the Russian regime?
When we talk about European unity and defense, especially if this conflict escalates or spills over, I think people need to be more honest about what we are actually dealing with. Because we always say Europe, but there is no Europe, not in a military sense at least. There is no unified command, there is no clear structure. It's just a collection of countries with overlapping interests, different priorities, and very, very different levels of readiness. And that's the core problem. When I first started working in intelligence over 15 years ago, we were already talking about long-term planning horizons. We are talking about 20, 25 years, because that is how long it takes to shift a military force around to something else. I mean, it's procurement cycles, production, building up the industrial capacity, training, recruiting, all of it. So you can't just throw billions at defense now and expect transformation overnight. It doesn't work like that. But that's exactly what's happening. Everyone is suddenly panicking, pushing insane amounts of money into defense. And yeah, sure, that is necessary, but it's not enough. The real challenge is control, command, and cohesion. Who is calling the shots? I mean, that's a big question. Because right now, people keep saying NATO will sort it out, NATO will step in. But NATO hasn't actually done anything in Ukraine on the official level. And Article 5, it's only been invoked once, and after 9/11. And that's a very different context. And even then, it was really, really messy. So we're basically putting our hopes in a system that most people don't fully understand, and that's never been tested under real European war conditions in the modern era. And let's be honest, from a Swedish perspective, we didn't even want NATO until 2 years ago. We were talking about Nordic defense, European battle groups, all of these regional concepts that sounded very good on paper. They actually look excellent on paper, but they really never got off the ground. It was just too little too late. And now people are talking about building a European army, but we can't even agree on how to buy ammo together, right? So yeah, we have strong national armies, we have capable forces, but what we don't have is a way to actually bring them together, control them, move them, or make decisions quickly. People focus so much on troops and tanks and flags, but if you can't control any of these units, what's the point? And it's not like we haven't tried. We have had these so-called battle groups that I talked about earlier over the years, different countries pooling forces for common missions. But let's be honest, they were weak, loosely assembled, rarely used, and never truly ready for high-intensity conflict. I mean, from the outside, it looked like cooperation, but it wasn't sustainable. So whether it's a grand European army or one of these patchwork coalitions, the result's been the same. No real command, no real readiness. And underneath that, we have all been living in the hangover from years of COIN. Everyone's been adapting to counterinsurgency, light forces, dispersed operations, peacekeeping mandates, expeditionary forces. And now we're trying to turn the culture around overnight. And you can't really just flip a switch and go from Afghanistan-style stabilization ops to large-scale conventional war. And that shift hasn't even happened yet. Not in structure and definitely not in mindset. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Then again, when the US picks up the phone, who are they supposed to call? Who is Europe? There is no one. Just a patchwork of systems and agendas. And if we don't fix that, if we don't build tight, functional alliances that can actually operate, we're going to end up with a lot of military power sitting still when it matters the most. I don't know, maybe that was a bit of a tangent, but that is what I've seen.
Felt pretty good to me, though. It felt like it's pretty real.
The next question is, how do you navigate rivalries between the troop contributing countries?
I maybe can take that one because that one's maybe more a peacekeeping one. It might be some of that in NATO and allies, but I think it's maybe more a peacekeeping one more broadly. Totally, my experience was, and I think I mentioned, was that I've worked and I've had Indian peacekeepers and Pakistani peacekeepers sitting side by side and working very well together. What happens in terms of nation states and national agendas maybe is a different topic. And then, of course, we've all united around the 2015 Cricket World Cup. I can't remember who won that one, but it doesn't matter. Oh, sorry, someone's putting up their hand. Who was that again? India. Oh, India won, right. I forgot. They seem to win everything these days. Cricket at least, so that's good. And also in terms of other countries, so I've seen that happening. There, of course, are flare-ups, between different people, but I don't think anyone wants to embarrass themselves. I think there was a time when, I think it was just after Russia invaded Crimea, and there was a helicopter unit run by the Ukrainians, and they had some colorful language in the logbooks that they had submitted to the Russian guy who was in charge of log ops afterwards, involving the president of Russia. So there are small things that you find, like a little bit of nudging and edging and banter, and maybe a bit more than banter. But I think my view is that people keep it kind of together on the political level. You might find that a host state doesn't want a country with political interests to come into their country. You can imagine, if you take Congo, what they would think about Rwandan peacekeepers coming in, or Ugandan peacekeepers. Absolutely not, because those countries were belligerents in the war in the late 90s, right? So they probably wouldn't want that. So a lot of it happens around the negotiating table.
And this is directed more to yourself again, Tony, and kind of going off what Hamza's asked. I wanted to ask if you came across situations where local authorities or factions had drastically different understandings of justice and peace, and if so, how might that have affected peacekeeping on the ground, and how did you navigate that?
It's a good question, and it's a difficult one. I can't say that I've directly experienced local groupings having a different understanding of justice and what that means and how we interacted with them. A lot of that, I think, is because I was too far away from the local population. As a combat engineer and as a military engineer, as staff officer of the brigade in this case, and previously with the infantry battalion, when I did a lot of interaction with locals, but I didn't have enough nuanced understanding. For me, it was kind of simple. I tried to keep it as simple as I could, just on a human level. Like, oh, there's a bridge that's broken. Let's plan it. Let's get in the civil engineers. Let's get in these people. Or there's some explosives, and we send out a specialized team. And our liaison with the local communities are much more about a practical thing. You need to get from point A to B, and then you'll find them cooperating because we're discussing something very logistical and something that will suit everyone. I think there are cases, if you look at different areas, where some people might think there's advantages from the local population or advantages given to certain groups over other groups. or some people have been disadvantaged, they might also feel that the UN doesn't provide that protection all the time. And so they'll rather form an alliance with an armed group because the UN might withdraw at some point, or they might show allegiance to the United Nations force. And then when they withdraw, they are at the mercy of that armed group. So I think a lot happens, a lot is subject to the geography and then the deployments of that. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a half-baked answer, but that's the best I have on that one.
I can definitely add a few lines to that. On the ground, this is a real problem, even if we're not talking about traditional peacekeeping operations, but more like Afghanistan or Iraq. It's the same dynamic. You can take a platoon of Swedes, drop them into a completely different environment, and yes, you get training, you read up on the culture, but the problem is you still don't understand what they need or what they want. And then yes, there's going to be a massive clash, a clash of what justice even is in its core. Because their traditions, their culture, their justice system, it's completely different from what we're used to. And if we can't comprehend that, we're going to try and force something they don't understand. We will just show up with a plan, thinking we're doing the right thing, but to them, it's just foreign. And that's where it breaks down. And as Tony was saying, you leave. At some point, you are going to pull out. And then when that happens, the whole thing just collapses because it never had roots. It was built on life support from the outside. And when you pull that plug, there's nothing left to hold it up. You can see it in Afghanistan. You can see it in Kosovo. We had troops in Kosovo for over 25 years now. And people are still asking, what happens if we leave? That's not a good sign. And you have to ask yourself, should it take 25 years to build a stable environment? Or maybe it takes 50. I don't know. But we keep failing at this over and over again because we don't stop to ask what people actually need. We try to enforce how we think it should look. We bring in a model and say, here is this beautiful Western democracy. You're just going to love it. And then we act so surprised when it doesn't work. But they are not us. They have to find their own version of what works. And that might look very different than ours. And of course, there has to be balance. If you're coming into a war-torn country where people have completely lost their compass, where there's no functioning system, then yes, you need to help build something. But you also have to understand how to do it. You have to understand the roots. If it doesn't come from the local culture and the population, it's never going to be sustainable. So yeah, these clashes are real and they're constant. And I don't think it's bad intent. Most people are trying to help. But when help turns into enforcement, it just doesn't stick. People need justice, but they need their own version of it, not ours. You tuned in, you're liking the vibe, so why not buy us a beer? Think of it as hydration for strategy. Head to undergroundstrategy.com/support and keep us in the fight. All right, back to business.
Thank you for your answer. I have a question. We discussed the sort of shift in peacekeeping missions towards a more sort of bottom-up or population-centric approach to the operationalization of the peacekeeping missions. So the question is, what impact you think current peacekeeping missions are having on local communities in the long term?
I'll take a stab at it, Max, and I'll throw it over to you. And I think Max will agree. And it's definitely something that we'll put to Peter de Clercq also, because he's quite passionate about it and he's written about this. It's really unfortunate, to start with. It's really unfortunate because the people on the ground are the ones that suffer effects of everything, all the decisions made by the higher ups, that Max was saying. I mean, I think in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's even more prominent, right? Like it was a conventional war followed by no plan for state building, followed by absolute power vacuum and disarray. So in that case, it's just unfair on everyone. In more traditional peacekeeping, there are attempts, very, very low-level attempts to where the local community is involved in that peace-building efforts, but their voice for the most part is unheard. And Peter, I don't want to take Peter de Clercq's thesis and his view. He always starts off by saying the charter is the UN is about the people. We the people that starts, not we the countries, we the members, it's we the people. And that really is the heart of it. You know, you guys have dealt with it in your studies and you've seen it in the world. God knows the human tragedies there. It starts with the Second World War and gets, you know, the sheer scale of the destruction, but it was people that was killed. Unfortunately, we've missed that in the creation. There's a cookie cutter, you know, yeah, that's how we do a peacekeeping mission. There's no consultation with the local population. We don't even sometimes know the different groupings, the nuance, the languages, the dialects. You know, later on we'll learn it. I think when the Americans first went into, or the Allied forces went into, I don't want to say just Americans, into Iraq, they didn't even have interpreters to communicate with the local groupings. I mean, my God, right? And there's, of course, the horrific stories that came with that just from misunderstandings. Of course, the UN has developed, and you know, there's a whole unit of translators, of interpreters now, so it's getting easier. But I feel for the large part, the local population is completely out of the equation. They have no seat at the table. And when they do, it's just for the purposes of the higher powers. So you need to translate for us. You need to do this for us. I need people to help build this. And then later when we leave, I don't think, maybe, you know, someone else can correct me, but I think for the most part, no one cares. It's just forgotten. You know, that's my very, maybe it's late in the afternoon, it's a very frank view of it, that it's a bit of a use and abuse situation. But Max, I'm not sure if you want to round off any points on that one.
I think you're right, Tony. That is exactly what we're missing. In anything that involves guns, whether it's war, peacekeeping, peace enforcement, or even police work, it has to be about the people. And the problem is, it never is. And I'll say this, if we ever see a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, I think it's going to work a bit better than what we're used to. Not because we are better, but because Ukraine already has a nation. It's strong, it's coherent, and we're going to need to help them polish some things, maybe trim their democracy a bit, but they're already on board. They know who they are. So in that case, yeah, we'll probably send in some, you know, fancy police officers, advisors, trainers, all of that will help them deter attacks and reinforce institutions, etc. That can absolutely work. But that's not the case in most countries, because most countries we actually go into, they're not like that. And I don't like using the term failed states, but they are. Most of them are. They're shattered. And when something is shattered, you don't fix it just by dropping troops in and calling it peacekeeping. You can definitely stop the war. That's the easy part. But then we forget about it. We walk away. And when that happens, all the people are gone from the process. We're just fighting against the wind and force and force and force and force. And we are not listening. We're not talking to people. We're not involving them. Still, after all of these years, you can look at Kosovo again. If we pull the Balkans tomorrow, it will be a disaster. And that's after 25 years. Nobody bothered to really understand the Albanian side, the Serbs, or any side at all. We are sitting there and forcing because that feels good to us, and it's something for us to show other nations that we're doing good. But nobody's asking, how do we build something? How do we get everyone involved? And not everyone is going to be happy, of course, but everyone needs to be involved in some way. And that is what we're still not good at. That should be the primary objective for anything that has to do with violence. Violence is just a short-term solution to stop more violence. That is all that it is. Everything after that has to be about the people, about making them active in their own community, in their own environment, working for their own environment. You go to Iraq, you go to Afghanistan, it's tribal, it's layered, it's complicated. You need people who understand that. You need people who understand what actually is going on, people who can read those layers. And we need to listen to the ones who live there all of their life. Ask them what they want, what's possible. Make them a part of the process. Because if you don't, you're just playing occupation. And we have all seen how that ends. So yeah, that was a long way to say that I agree with Tony.
My way of wrapping up, really, what do you think are some of the key or core lessons that peacekeeping forces should learn from the past missions?
I think it's the same lesson every time. It doesn't really matter if it's strategical or tactical or on the political level or ground level. It's about preparation. And not just preparing your logistics or your gear, but preparing to understand. In the West, we have the tools, we have the cultural training, the political analysis, all of that. The human systems are up. We have ways to know the places we go, but we don't use them, not properly. Instead, it always becomes, how do we bomb this more effectively? How do we catch the most people? How do we manipulate the local politics? Who can we put in power that aligns with our foreign policy goals for the next 20 years? What is the intelligence angle here? That whole kind of mindset has to go. You got to switch into human mode. I mean, everyone, from the private to the general, everyone has to be operating with a humanistic mindset. Even in a military peacekeeping or peace enforcement role, your job is still about people. You have to absorb what's happening. You have to be open. And you need systems that allow what's seen on the ground to actually move up the chain. It's not about when the next ambush is. It's not about how many terrorists are in a certain village. It's about how people are doing. Is anything actually improving here? That mindset has to be built into peacekeeping at all levels. It has to be organic, something that grows and connects every single part of the mission towards this one clear goal, the people. But right now, that's not what we train for. Even peacekeeping forces, we're still training for effective killing. And that's the truth. How do we clear the village faster? How do we process targets more efficiently? That's what we still drill for. And if that is your mindset before you even deploy, then it's already doomed. It has to be a shift. Otherwise, we're just running the same failed playbook again and again and again. So, yeah, that's my 5 or maybe 2 cents on that one.
Yep. I mean, I'm only going to say one more thing before we close up on that. As Max said, that short-term violence he mentioned is sometimes the necessary evil. And I think we looked at the case study of Bosnia and how eventually they lifted that siege of Sarajevo. And there was a few things, right, that happened. The Croats got involved too, that ended that war with NATO air support, etc. But then after that, it's that discussion that must happen. And it's a very difficult pivot to make. In fact, we humans like the easy answer, right? And that's why, as Max said, that K4 is still there. And if they leave, because we don't have Kosovo in the news. I think in the UK, the last time it was in the news was about the number plates a year or 2 ago. That was the last time that I remember it coming up on the World Podcast on the news, right? So it doesn't feature for us. But the tensions that number plate saga brought up is still very present. That was just a little microcosm of it. I think I have nothing more to add. All I can say is that we were taken to school today about peacekeeping and peace enforcement by everyone. So a big thank you to everyone. And we'll wrap it up there, Max.
Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed this discussion. It has been fantastic. And that concludes part 1 of this discussion. Part 2 drops next Thursday when the students will sit down with former UN diplomat Peter de Clercq, and you really don't want to miss that. Thank you all for listening. Bye-bye.